I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. On today's podcast, we have a great privilege to interview Dr. Steve Hardy, and I'm going to have Cara introduce Dr. Hardy because there's a lot of fun family history here.
So, Dr. Steve Hardy has served with SIM International Advocate for Theological Education, and he is also Senior Advisor to the International Council for Evangelical Theological Education. He worked as a missionary educator in Brazil, Mozambique, South Africa, and has traveled extensively as an educational consultant. He developed an Institute for Excellence in Theological Education for Overseas Council and has directed the International Scholar Program for Langham Partnership, which is John Stott Ministries. His writings have focused on issues of quality in training and education administration. He has been married for 48 years to LeAnne, and they have 2 grown daughters, Katie and Erika, and 3 grandkids.
Yeah, but that's only part of the story. I've heard some backstory. So tell me a little bit more about what you know about Dr. Hardy.
Yeah, so that's his professional bio. The personal connection here is that Dr. Steve Hardy and his wife LeAnne actually 45 years ago were in Ethiopia with my parents, all teaching at an MK school, and there's several other couples there that have been long-term family friends. And when the revolution broke out in the 70s, they all had to leave. The school shut down, and then Steve and LeAnne a few years later ended up being in Brazil, and they encouraged my parents to go to Brazil, so we can blame Steve and LeAnne for our family being in Brazil. And in fact, fun fact is the home that they bought as part of our mission. They ended up leaving to go to Mozambique, and we lived in that home, and I grew up in that home that they had bought. So it's just there's a lot of fun family connections. Our families have just stayed connected over the years, and he is fondly Uncle Steve to me. Okay. And he has visited us in pretty much every home we have lived in.
Wow, that's fun. And I think you're really going to enjoy, because Steve is bringing a perspective from training a mission involved in mission training efforts around the world. And often we can just kind of focus on what's happening in America, going to other countries, but there are thousands, millions, literally millions of missionaries being trained in other parts of the world to go to other places in the world. And so Steve's going to open our eyes a little bit to that today. So I really hope that you can just enjoy this episode of the Innkeepers podcast as we talk to Dr. Steve Hardy. Well, Steve, welcome to the Innkeepers podcast, and we're grateful that you've made the time for us today to be part of this interview. I would just ask if you would take a minute and introduce yourselves to our listeners and tell us a little of your background in history and how you sort of moved into the area of missions training.
Well, thank you. It's an interesting experience to be a part of this. I think what you're doing is wonderful, and to contribute to it is my pleasure. I'm a grow-up out of Minnesota. In my grow-up imagination, I never would have been a missionary or a pastor ever. My background would have been teaching. I was interested in lots of other things, but the idea of growing up to a profession where people kissed babies and had to be nice all the time just never quite made my imagination of things that the Lord might have me to do. I was a believer, grew up in a good church, good family. We ended up in a very secular university setting, and I got involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship with a lot of people who were not believers. And it it was interesting to be pushed into ministry and see God at work. And it was that ultimately took us into ministry. I met my wife through InterVarsity. We were involved in a training camp together, and InterVarsity said to me, "We think your gifts lie in teaching." And so pushed up, finished my seminary training in Minnesota. I had done my college work in Ohio. And then we got an invitation to go to Ethiopia, which is where I would have met Kara's parents, who were teaching at a missionary kids school. We became friends while we were there, and we watched a country blow up because there was a revolution about to happen. My undergraduate work was in political science, and had done a lot of reading under the church under communism, and to watch Ethiopia move into a revolutionary era, and then see what happened to the church, a largely non-literate church, and how God was with them. My ideas of leadership were totally pushed, because I always imagined leaders were people like me, educated, younger, and suddenly to see people who couldn't read and write, but God was using them. It changed the way I saw the world. And we would have stayed in Ethiopia forever, except that none of us could. So we were appointed to full career missionary service, and we were sent to Brazil, where we lived for 6 years. I loved Brazil, got involved in a lot of training, but we'd always wondered about, was the Lord ever going to take us back to Africa? And after a certain period of time, we were invited back to Mozambique in Southern Africa, which is Portuguese. And so I did doctoral training in missiology, to train myself as a missionary, because I was beginning to have a lot of questions I just couldn't answer, and how to teach and train cross-culturally. And we went to Mozambique for 6 years. I became known as somebody who asked a lot of questions, and I'm reasonably good at telling stories. So I'd hear things that other people would say and share it and pass it on. And that actually pushed me both in terms of mission leadership, and in terms of ministry involvement, to a lot of educational consultancy. And a lot of that is majority world training. So it's kind of where I got pushed into the world of training and training of trainers. We've spent most of our time living in Africa, I suppose. But we end up moving mission organizations. We were with a denominational group in both Ethiopia and Brazil. And then we moved under the umbrella of what became SIM. I worked with the international office, in helping to coordinate theological education. I am currently in the world of the semi-retired, or the non-practicing retirees. So I continue to do a fair amount of training, traveling overseas, some mentoring, some teaching as possible. But we're living in Northwest Wisconsin right now, on a lake in the woods, and it's a glorious place to be. I got 2 grown kids and 3 grandkids, and it's the greatest thing a person can do.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so good to just hear a bit of your story, and I just love how God used both you and LeAnne and my parents, and so many people from those days in Ethiopia ended up all over the world doing things that God hadn't planned for you guys, that you never would have done, never would have chosen for yourself. So it's just cool. So you have been 30 plus years doing training of trainers, as you said, and I'm guessing that you have seen some trends and some changes and some things happen over the years. Can you paint a picture for us of kind of what has been happening in the world of missions training?
Well, what's changed in missions is the internationalization of it. Where we were in Ethiopia, missionaries still ran everything. They were in charge of the cash register. They translated Sunday school materials. They had national people working with them or for them. And then suddenly a revolution comes. Well, that revolution has been global. And so, we have seen this within our SIM organization. but where they have an increasing number of people from anywhere to anywhere. And so the changing paradigms. I mean, we noticed this when we were in Mozambique. There were a lot of Brazilians that would come, and they'd last about 6 months and they'd burn out and go home. And the main reason was the lack of training. So, I mean, what has changed has been this awareness that we really do need to equip people for these cross-cultural tasks that they're a part of.
So you were talking about people moving cross-culturally, and I've had some interaction with some other Ethiopian missionaries that are Ethiopians who are training missionaries in their country. Mm-hmm. Some of them are sending missionaries within Ethiopia to other parts of the country, mm-hmm. and then some of their trainees are moving outside and going to other places, and that mm-hmm. they're saying the same things, that if they don't train their workers, they last a year or two at the most, and then they come back and they just don't know what to do, and because they didn't have the skills to adapt into their new culture. And then sadly, when they come back, it's a tough transition back too. So I'm guessing you're seeing and hearing about things like that as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the group that SIM works with is currently one of the largest, if not the largest, evangelical denomination in Ethiopia. About 10 million people in one denomination, and they have a huge missions vision. Something like 800 missionaries, most of whom work within Ethiopia in a cross-cultural situation. A lot of Muslim outreach, some working with Orthodox. They're just, as well as people that have gone, into China, into Pakistan, into parts of Asia, because Ethiopians have a passport that take them a lot of places that Western folk can't easily go. They don't look Western. Ethiopians don't quite look European. They don't quite look African. They behave in ways that actually provide them with open doors that many people don't have. And they're huge vision for sharing Jesus. They can live in some very awkward situations, but as you say, they've needed some training. How do you do what you do? They have a wonderful program in a place called Durami, which was created by former missionaries who basically came home and set up a program not for people who haven't been missionaries, but for people who have been, and who have some of these frustrating questions and issues. A lot of emphasis on character, on patience, on reflection. What have you done, and what does that mean? And their staff are all ex-missionaries as well. So, they've been very careful how they put it together, who comes and who gets to teach. The effect has been that you've got a really good outreach coming out of Ethiopia.
So, in addition to Ethiopia, tell us about some of the other places that are really on the map, so to speak, in terms of missionary training and sending.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there has been a growth coming in so many places. Nigeria has a huge, missionary a feeling to go. And then within Nigeria, you have had churches or institutions that have taken on training. I was part of a conference several years ago in Malawi for church leadership, and to tell them, the gospel first came to Mozambique, not from Westerners, but from people that came out of Malawi, that walked along the rail line and shared Jesus as they went. The pastors had no idea. So to begin to discover how people have been used in sharing cross boundaries, it really has become a global thing. Brazil has become a major player in global missions. Folk that are going into North Africa, in some of these Muslim areas in North Africa. Again, Brazilians don't look like Europeans. They don't look like Africans. They're someplace in between, and culturally, they've got an expression, dar jeito. They can make it work.
They can finagle anything.
They can figure it out, and so they don't need the rules to be in place. They'll they'll fly it. And so they go very easily. The problem has been the cultural problem. How do you learn somebody else's culture so you're not offensive? Because the first missionaries we saw in places like Mozambique, they just didn't last very long, as was true in Ethiopia, has been true in lots of places. So to be able to sit down and say, how do you listen before you answer? How do you learn the questions and not simply provide for them the materials and the methodologies that work just fine in Brazil, but Africa is a different place. The Middle East requires a level of sensitivity. So, I mean, there has been an increasingly, this let's try it. Let's do it together. Let's reflect on it. And so there have been some very good programs. For example, where Clara's parents were in Rio, there's a good program up in João Pessoa, up in the Northeast. There's some strong Pentecostal training that's coming out of the Sao Paulo area. And most of their faculty tend to be people who have served someplace else and then can come back and help people to learn these basic cultural issues. I did a missions training at one point. We had worked in West Central Brazil, a place called Campo Grande. And I was invited by the Bible school there to come back and do a week of missions training. And I had just arrived in Mozambique, and it was frustrating. We were the first missionaries back after about 25 years. The church had mushroomed in growth. There were almost no leaders for the church. And I really didn't know how best to respond to the realities. So I came back to Brazil and I painted a pretty complicated, difficult picture. And it was interesting, some of the gung-ho Brazilians who would have left yesterday suddenly got a little bit second thoughts about maybe I shouldn't. People who had never considered missions were ready to go, because taking on the reality of challenges and they're just in places like Brazil, there has been this enthusiasm for missions. It needs to be coupled with training for missions, with cultural understanding. The way I see it is not necessarily how others see it. There's a lot of missionaries coming out of places like Korea. You'll see Korean missionaries everywhere. My kids did their high school, junior high and high school training, in Kenya, and about a third of the students at this particular boarding school came from Kenya, or came from Korea, and they're the Korean churches had the same issue. They know how to do it in Korea, and they tend to want to do the same thing when they go into China, when they go into Africa, when they go into other places. So there has been this growing development of missions training in places like Korea, so that you learn language, you learn culture, you learn to listen before you learn to answer. But the reality is there's a lot of mission folk coming from places other than the traditional Western mission sending places.
Yeah, and I think it's been a challenge for Western missionaries to learn that cultural humility and the willingness to listen and learn and not come with all the answers. And now I feel like the other countries that you're speaking about are having to learn the same lesson. Not that we've mastered it as Western missionaries by any means, but I think that is this kind of cultural narcissism is something that all of us have.
Yeah.
We think the way we do it is the way everybody should do it.
Sure.
And so it takes
and that's logical and reasonable.
Yeah. So it takes
one of the things that you see in today's world is a younger generation seems more capable of serving with those who come from elsewhere. If your team leader is from India or your team leader is from Nigeria, and half your team is Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala, Italy, wherever, a younger generation of Western missionary doesn't seem to have the same problem of not being in charge. It's the missionaries who have been there for 15, 20 years, have learned this is the way it needs to be. This is the way it's been, this is the theory. And so it seems to me it's harder for an older, they've been there for a while generation than it tends to be for a younger generation.
Yeah, I wonder if that has to do with like the globalization that's happening just in general in our world. And our younger generation is much more connected globally than perhaps an older generation.
Could be. I mean, one of the things we say in education, practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent.
Yeah.
If you do the same thing wrong 1,000 times, you'll do that same wrong thing forever. Experience is not the best teacher. It's reflection on experience that makes for educational learning. And so the fact that you've done something or seen something doesn't make it normative. You actually need to come back, and this is where the training piece comes in. As you listen to others who have the same experience, as someone guides you to think about your experience, there's a higher probability to go, and there's this aha that comes out of the experience that you've had.
So, looking at the global effort that's happening in these countries that you've mentioned and in other places, is there room at the table for trainers and teachers from the U.S.?
That's an awkward question to answer with a simple yes or no.
Well,
yeah. If there are people with experience and with voices that would contribute wonderfully to the table. But there's this need for humility of being one voice among several. That if a person comes with this arrogant sense of I have something to say, they probably won't work out very well because of this long colonial tradition that's already out there working against us. But I mean, there are a lot of people with fantastic experience and stories to tell, especially those that have learned some negative things along the way and have had some more difficult experiences. If I've only had success, I probably don't have a whole lot to talk about that other people want to listen to. And it's out of the struggle and the these cross-cultural difficulties that I think it qualifies someone to be able to share a little bit more intelligently. We need to be able to work with, and in this context of working with, yes, there is. I don't know that I don't know that I'm wild, for example, about short-term mission teams that think they're doing mission. Those that go to learn or go to see or go to come back and pray better or go to come back and prepare better, it's a wonderful experience. But then to call it mission is awkward, because there is so much value in language learning, of that cultural understanding of, I'll say it differently. This was an African story that someone told to me of a well-trained doctoral guy came to Kenya to work, and he said to the head of the church, he says, I really just want to learn how best I can serve you. And the bishop goes, fine, you can be my driver. And so for almost 2 years, this doctoral trained missionary was driving the bishop around to all of his appointments. He sat in all the meetings, but for 2 years, he was the driver. And after 2 years, the guy began to get frustrated because I didn't really come to Africa to just be your driver. And what he failed to realize is that in those 2 years, he had seen what almost no one ever had the opportunity to see, because he had been watching the inner workings of how church leadership dealt with problems. He met with people, he heard people, he was in a learning situation. He just hadn't realized it. And that's part of the answer to the question. If we can get Western folk into learning situations, my goodness, there is so much that God can do through them. They're just an attitude issue that needs to be.
And it sounds from what you've shared previously is that all of us from all the different countries are having to come to the table as learners in order to be effective. Doesn't matter what country you come from, to or from, or we have to be willing to sit and listen first.
Yeah, I mean, how I got involved in a lot of this, in my real exposure to the need for training, when I first began to do a lot of the educational consultancy, and I would go to visit these institutions primarily in Africa, although I did a lot of travel back and forth to Latin America as well as into what is Eastern Europe. But I would sit down with some really significant, important, big name people, and I would be sitting in their office, and I would say to them, how are you? And I would sit there. And honestly, I was a nobody. I didn't have a checkbook. I couldn't write them a big check. I wasn't the head of an organization. I was simply there to learn about their training programs, to understand better what the needs were. I was doing evaluation and things on it. And I would say to them, how are you? And they would push the door shut, and you'd see this tear come down their cheek, and they would tell me. Because most of the leaders that I have worked with have not been trained for the jobs they've been asked to do. That's true of missionaries. You end up being, as I was in Campo Grande, I became the academic dean of a seminary. I know nothing about I didn't at the time. I knew nothing about academic leadership. And suddenly you're in charge. You become the head of something. And what do you know about curriculum development and teacher training? And what do you know about evaluation and governance and fundraising? And there's a whole host of skill set pieces that are involved trying to run training institutions. And these poor people were absolutely overwhelmed. And then you add the normal pressures of life, of family, of kids, of health, and a whole host of things. And so asking these really complicated questions, how are you, just unleashed a whole host of needs, of things, and to pray with people, to listen to people, to respond, to come back to them again. I was always welcome to return, because I tried not to come with an agenda. And so we set up a lot of training workshops. What I do now, I'm considered a senior advisor to the International Council of Evangelical Theological Education. It's a global umbrella of networks of Bible schools and training programs. We've done a lot of academic leadership training where you sit down with people and functionally not only give them the skills, but you give them the time to be a community, to deal with other kinds of issues. Because one of the other new things that's happening is discovering that people need to keep growing. They need pastoral care. They need somebody, who can ask them, how are you doing? Pastors need pastors, and missionaries need pastors, of someone who can simply care for them. That's an international concern and not simply a Western mission issue. We need to find better ways globally to simply care for the people that are in all these fantastic, roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, so that kind of leads me to this question of how do you see missionary care happening around the world? Training is happening, but is that a piece that still needs to be implemented around the world?
Well, I'm sure it does. What's encouraging are the organizations, like you, who are taking this seriously, and finding ways to reach out and to touch people and to share and to minister. My SIM has worked really hard at trying to develop, a variety of levels of leadership training, of continuing education, of care of leaders and people in general, recognizing everyone has leadership skills. How do we equip you for what you're doing? How are you doing? They're organizationally, you've got a lot of investment in infrastructure within the mission, and that infrastructure involves, multicultural team training and sensitivity to issues. I run into people. There are ministries like Barnabas Ministry, which I have met in many places. I love what they do. They care for people, and they're being done by people who know what they're doing. But they're not just Westerners.
Uh-huh.
So I think there is a growing sense that this is something that we're part of a global community. How do we keep our eyes on everybody else so that we all stay healthy? How can I pray for you? How you doing?
Mm-hmm. So it's like this hand in hand of training, being equipped to do the job they're asked to do, and caring for the whole person.
Clearly.
Needs to be happening all over the world.
Mm-hmm. And it and our part involves too. When somebody says to me, "How you doing?" I need to take the question seriously. Don't flip it off. I'm not going to bury them with information they don't want. But when somebody like you asks me that question, I will answer it. Because I just think it's teaching others as well as it's being cared for.
So really what I'm hearing also is that whenever anyone is in one of these training roles, they not only are going as a teacher, but they kind of have to go with a empathetic or compassionate ear to listen as well. I mean, that is maybe nothing that's trained or taught, but it's something that really is going to benefit everyone in the end.
Mm-hmm. We talk in education about the impact of the invisible curriculum. What students are going to learn in a Bible school about pastoring didn't come from something said in class. It came from the community that they were a part of. And so the way that a teacher treats someone who's older, the way that men treat women, women treat men, the way you treat different ethnic groups, the behavior, the evidence of grace in a community is going to shape students for pastoral ministry. It's going to shape students for cross-cultural ministry. So how we do it shapes. The teacher is the curriculum. And so who we are is going to impact what happens in those that we're there to train. I think those are things that we can observe before we let somebody go. Someone who is very self-centered, who is working through their own agenda, that every time they meet with people, it's their own personal therapy group. We probably shouldn't send them off, and we can see that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was interesting. The 11 years we spent at the Worldview Center, where we had the opportunity to meet Cara and initially, and literally hundreds of other guests from around the world. The things when people would leave and the feedback they would give us and they would talk about, because we moved there with our 4 adult, growing adult children, finishing high school, doing college kind of thing. The feedback we consistently got was people's observation about how we interacted as a family.
Sure.
That was nothing. I mean, I never set out to teach anyone about how to interact with your family, but they watched it, they saw it, and it was very humbling for someone to talk about how you interact with your family. It's like, oh yeah, I guess you would have seen that, wouldn't you? So anyway,
They were watching. They were
watching.
Well, I was a speaker at an university camp, post-university days, and I think I had 12, 15, I don't remember, sessions, and I had prepared intensely, to try to do a really good job, as a teacher at this camp. And at the end of it was a 4-week camp training experience. At the end of the time, one of the students stood up and he says, I have been totally transformed this month through something that Steve said. So I'm thinking to myself, which one of my 15 sessions was this, And it was a casual conversation over lunch where nothing had been prepared. You're simply interacting. But it was something that God used, and it changed his life. And so, it's in these relationships. And to me, this is where the training part steps in. How do we help people to be aware of their impact? How do you become aware of do you realize what you just said? Do you realize what you just did? And there's a transparency here, because none of us are even close to perfect. Everybody else knows that. It's we who don't tend to see that.
Yeah.
And yet there's a lot of grace out there. How do we make this work?
Yeah. I think so much of how an awareness that we are discipling those around us. I'm discipling my children. They're watching. People are watching all of us way more than I think we give that credit for. Yeah. That is teaching. It's not just a curriculum. And I love how you talked about that invisible curriculum. We are all have an invisible curriculum that we're teaching.
Yeah. Which says to me, if we're going to do missions training, who is going to be our teaching team?
Yeah.
Because we're not simply asking, what all have they studied? That is part of it. You ought to know enough to be able to teach. But one of the things I like about adult education is that every student in some area knows more than I do. Doesn't threaten me. It really doesn't bother them. But I'm the teacher, and there's a role that's there. But I can be a learner even as I'm helping to facilitate their learning. But I need to know enough to be able to do the class. I need to have enough experience to be able to teach the class. I need to be the kind of person or character and relationally, because that's going to be in the long run the impact on your students. So if you're putting your team together, what kind of people do we want? And who they are and what kinds of relationships, what kind of track record they have is going to have far more impact on, in the end, the missions training that's done, than how many books we read or how many biblical passages or theological passages. And I'm not against content, but there's simply more to it than that.
So what do you think that we as Westerners can learn from these schools and from the training that's happening around the world?
That's a good question. A part of it, I think, is we need to listen. We need to let people tell their stories, so that when we meet somebody who's involved in a, Ethiopia Durrani missions training program, we simply let them, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? How did you put this together? What stories are you hearing? And so we simply put ourselves in a situation where other people can tell us about, the activities that they're involved in. We honor them by hearing their stories. And for us to have an opportunity to either share those stories or to hear them directly ourselves, I think it's a gift we make to other programs. When books get put together, inevitably they're Western books that get translated into gazillion languages. Where is it that we put together somebody else's story and shared it?
Yeah.
And so kind of at a publication level, at the story level, whose stories do we retell? And I think we honor these programs by listening to them, and we honor them even more by using them as we talk and sharing their stories. So we probably need to be proactive in this. There are missions organizations. What WEA has done in their missions commission and missions training, Bill Taylor, who's just stepped down from it. But some of these other folk that have been, very involved in the kind of missions training globally, we simply need to be part of sharing these stories. When we hear them, let's pass them on.
Yeah. So that leads to my question. Is there currently a means or an avenue that the Western Church can be more informed or more well educated about mission efforts around the world so that we can pray for them and we can kind of champion them?
There are. There used to be some bulletins that came out that I don't think exist anymore. The World Evangelical Alliance has a missions commission, and they do put out materials. And you've got a variety of missions efforts that are coming out of this. It is probably worth getting on mailing list. Mostly my contact comes from asking, what you know about what is. Now, I travel more than most, but to meet people and let people tell me stories. When missionaries come through local churches, ask them, what have they seen about what local churches or national folk are doing to share the gospel? What is being done to care for people, to train people and equip people? And we might be surprised about the extent that things are going on that we never knew about.
So in essence, being curious ask the question of the people who do have the contact with other places in the world.
Yeah. We live in the middle of nowhere, and one of the local girls out of the church worked in a project with Operation Mobilization in India. She met this good-looking Indian guy, pastor. They got married, and have now got about 5 kids and stuff. But they have gotten involved in Indian outreach, and they tell fantastic stories. And with all the COVID going on in India, and relatives who get sick, and just to getting on their prayer letter list. Indians do such an incredible job of sharing the gospel in a context that has been very, very difficult. We need to hear the stories. We to get on somebody's prayer letter list when they come through, just finding ways to hear some of these update stories. There are folks in the Twin Cities that are trying to reach out to ethnic communities, they worked in Senegal for many years. There are a lot of Brazilians working in Senegal. The world is small enough, but these are folk who have come home from Senegal. They're now working, in the Twin Cities area to reach out to the Thais, to reach out to the folk that come from Sudan, that come from Somaliland, and of which there are a Hindu temple that sits in the Twin Cities, and Muslim communities community that's there and things on it. There's lots that's global around us. We need to hear the stories. Chinese Hospitality House out of Twin Cities as well, reaching Chinese. Chinese tell stories about China. Just to be able to hear these things, we don't need to be quite so isolated.
Yeah, that just makes me wonder about our role here at Sanctuary Inn and how we can help facilitate some of these stories and some of this storytelling, and makes me think about a whole nother podcast idea to share, to start interacting with some of these people and sharing some of these in maybe a short little snippet sort of format. But anyway, it's got my brain going there.
So, are there groups or missionaries serving in places around the world that just you want their story to be known? And as you're talking about these stories, I mean, is there something that, like, wow, the world needs to know that God is at work in these places, and maybe we don't know, and maybe sometimes sometimes it's in closed countries that we can't really talk about, but I mean, is there an encouraging story you could share with us of God is on the move in ways we don't even expect?
Well, what pops into my mind, there's a young couple that will actually be at our church in middle of July from Albania in part of Europe that was declared to be totally secular. There was no known church, no known believers at all in Albania. What I got to know was a man by the name of Peter Kuzmic. Peter was a bit of a European evangelist, comes out of Slovenia, set up a training program in Osijek, which is now Croatia. It was a country that was non-aligned inside of the communist area. And so during the Soviet days, it was the only known evangelical seminary functioning inside of the Soviet Union. And they trained people for Poland and for Romania and for all these countries because you could do it in Croatia. Two guys showed up from Albania. That were living, sort of as ethnic refugees in Croatia, and so they did theological training, and this Peter got them involved writing and developing materials, and so they wrote books, they developed training materials for a church that nobody knew if it even existed, and they got people out of the Croatian former Yugoslavia area to publish this books, and then the Soviet Union fell apart, and little by little there were some things that began to happen in Albania, and yet God had already prepared the way, through folk that had nothing to do with Albania to have materials ready, so that there were some Bible commentaries and some training materials, and there are some folk that have gone to work, to help to set up some of the ministry things that were there, and a couple out of our little church went over to teach at a school and met this young couple, Tony and Ida, who are pastors doing church planting in a place that 20 years ago we didn't know it had a church. And this is being done by people who are not Western. I just think it's cool. Albania is not a country in which I've ever eaten pizza. I've never been there.
Yeah, what our listeners don't know is that Steve Hardy, I think, holds some Guinness World Record of having had 88 countries, right? Is it 88 countries?
88 countries in which I have eaten pizza, and Albania is not one of them.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll try to engineer some way to get you to Albania so you can put Albania on your list. So
yeah, here.
Yeah. Well, we have really enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything kind of in wrap up or closing that you want us to hear, or you want our listeners to hear about what's happening around the world in terms of non-Western missionary training?
Nothing that we haven't actually said. I mean, the amazing thing to me is that there is an international presence taking the gospel places that we had no idea it was happening. And we meet people doing what somehow in the back of our mind had to be done by us but it's being done by God's people in ways that we never would have imagined. And I just think that's amazing. I mean, for us to be able to hear these stories is our pleasure. To be able to pray for these people and find ways to be supportive, it's just good. And say to these folk, how you doing? Because I think they have stories to tell, and I think there's a lot of ways we can pray for them and care for them.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing. And I'm just so glad that we got this time to hear a little bit more of your story and your interaction and your investment in God's kingdom in this way. And I, for one, want to be more aware of praying for missions training, that, you know, God is on the move, moving people, his people all over the world.
Amen.
And the work is going to be done, whether we're a part of it or not, but we want to be a part of it. So, yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
And you know you have a standing invitation to Sanctuary Inn whenever you're in the area.
Thank you.
Well, Cara, did you enjoy that conversation with Steve?
I really did. It's just so good to hear his heart. And I just think Steve Hardy has so much experience and wisdom in all the places. I wish I could be a fly on the wall in some of the places and conversations he's been at over the years in these 88 countries he's been to, and just the investment that he's made in the kingdom.
Yeah. And just hearing that he's encouraging us as Sanctuary Inn to be able to tell some of the stories. And so now I'm eager to start trying to compile some of these stories and maybe have the opportunity to share them with some of our listeners. I think one thing he said that really caught my attention when we talked about the role of North America in the missions training world, he said, if you're willing to be one voice among many voices, then there's a place at the table. And so I really hope that that's something that we can take forward from here.
Yeah, and I just love how so much of our conversation was that piece of cultural humility and a willingness to learn and be a part of the team. We're not any better than anybody else. God is using every nationality to reach every nationality.
Yeah, we don't have to be the team captain.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, this is Steve.
And this is Cara.
And thank you again for listening to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers for kingdom purposes. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, and maybe you were prompted to pass this along to someone you know that will benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy schedules to help us learn more about missionary care.
We also want to thank Tim Downing for the music that he wrote and performed specifically for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can learn more about him and his work at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos and is produced by Tim Cowley of Cowley Visuals. If you have media needs, including film, photography, or audio, you can reach Tim at cowleyvisuals.com.
Our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Gibbons, Cara's amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website and learn more about the ministry of Sanctuary Inn at sanctuaryinn.org. Thank you again for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.
See you next time.